Good morning. I hope you had the kind of week I did. A really, really good. Everything seemed to fall in place. Discovering so much answered prayer. It's amazing. It always amazes me. And I like to stay in that amazed state of mind. It's a good place to be. Kim, thank you for the music. Ladies, Carter, Terry, everyone that's participated in any way, we are so grateful for you. I don't know what I would do up here without you. I have to start this with a joke I've been wanting to tell you for 3 years. And it was already 20 years old. I can't seem to work it in to where it really makes any sense of what it... So just, it's not going to make any sense. But anyway, there was a place of business, and they put a help wanted sign in the window. And here's what it said: must be an excellent typist, must be an expert with a computer, and must be bilingual. Well, of all of the things, this little dog, every time I think about this joke, I think about Henry's dog, Bentley, but this bright-eyed little dog comes running up, grabs the sign. Before anybody could stop him, he takes the sign up, and here's the personnel manager, and he drops it on his desk, and he goes running to the typewriter, and he's typing like 125 words a minute without any error. And then he runs over to the computer, and he's bringing up all of his stuff on the computer. This man is so amazed, and he says, I can't believe what you've done in typing. And he said, it's so amazing. He said, you're wonderful on the computer. And then he thought, and he said, but he said, are you bilingual? And the dog went, meow. Well, at some point, I was going to spring that one on you, but I did wait 3 years, though. 3 years. The title, someone said, look, somebody's canceled and you're speaking again today, and give me a title. And so I've had this thing on my mind about harmony in particular, but it really applies sort of everywhere, but it's an emerging force. Now, that might sound like it's sort of like a universal thing or supposed to be part of whatever's happening in the world or whatever, but actually everything comes down to the individual. So, for the purpose of this emerging force, we realize that it's still just a part of all of the divine energy of the universe. There's not any separating out or anything of this sort. It's simply part of that divine energy. And then there is that thing within ourselves when one day, maybe not for everybody, but one day we discover that there is a force within us. And that as we give our attention to it and as we cultivate it, it begins to grow, and it is an emerging force and begins to change our life. Now, I've looked at so many stories and so many people of the Bible, those stories, and it's so interesting to see how each person developed as they began to realize the presence of God in their life. And I think about Jesus at a very early age. There's only one little story in there about when he was young, and I've looked it over, and I just wonder if it's exactly the way it was written, or could there be any little variance there? Well, I always just accept everything just like it said, but he's lost off from his parents. What they've done, they've made the pilgrimage down to Jerusalem for the Passover, and so in the mobs that gather, well, he's lost, and they don't know where he is, so they look around and finally find him, that he's listening to the elders and to the teachers in the synagogue. And so when they question him about, like, I can just imagine what they must have said, and he said, well, I must be about my Father's business. There's a way that could have been said to where you would think, well, that brat. Or there is a way that it could have been said and means something spiritual, which that's the way I take it. A very, very spiritual thing, in that he felt that emerging force within him as a little kid. Unfortunately, I don't think I ever, there were so many forces within my life, but it seemed like a long time before I ever got to that force which was within. Well, when we look at this, to establish where we're coming from with this emerging force, let's take a look at the fact that there is only one power in the universe. Recently, I guess in Waco, Pat and I were doing things to teach people a little bit about other religions. And so we did this thing because we had this film. It was like a movie. And so we have a big classroom. It was, when there was weddings, it was the bride's room, but then it was a huge classroom. So we had a place, we put the film, the video together. And this wonderful, articulate Jewish fella did this whole thing about the Kabbalah. And what I've noticed about that word is that if I'm talking to somebody and I say Kabbalah, they say Kabbalah. Or if I say Kabbalah, they will say Kabbalah. I'm always corrected on that, so I'm a little dizzy about it, so if I sound that way. What was so fascinating is how near our beliefs were to what we believe in unity or now in harmony fellowship. It had a sort of a new or different twist than, say, like, for example, the Old Testament, until we got to one thing. The one thing, and I wanted to actually talk about that one thing a little bit. But it was when finally we got to, he called it Satan. Now, the thing about the devil is this, and I know you might say the hell you say, but I have done such a good job in the day of screwing up everything that I didn't feel like I really got full attention in that area. But here is what I have learned, that there is only one force, whatever anybody thinks or whatever, and it's okay. I'm not worried about what anybody else is thinking about. I'm more concerned about how I am experiencing God on a day-to-day basis. That's what my concern is supposed to be about. But there is just one power. But I've had people say, well, what about the evil that is in the world? Well, there is evil, and it appears to be an original emerging force, and it is a force. But evil, or whatever someone might refer to as the devil, is simply a resistance to the one power that is, and that resistance to God creates the illusion of another power. And it certainly does create a lot of activity that looks terrible in the world today. And we begin to look at it, we're saying, well, how could this possibly be? But the truth is There is just one power and one life, and that life is God. The presence of God within us is what makes us function. If you're breathing, it's the presence of God that is there making it possible. The breath that you have, the cells of your body, everything that exists, all of the invisible world, all of the visible world, all of the planets, the very way the universe works itself is all God. There is no creativity other than that. We are sometimes co-creators, but we are part of that force. I don't know whether I'd ever really made that perfectly clear, and whether one agrees or not. This is where I'm always coming from. Okay, now, we have individual expressions, or we actually are individual expressions and demonstrations of this force. Now, in looking at the way this force works within people has been the most wonderful study of my life. It's really not been wonderful, it's been confusing. That's a better way. I was hoping David, because when you get a degree in psychology, and I was hoping he was here, then you began to know everything about all of this. But then, here I am, just sort of groping around, trying to figure out. But there's some of the most wonderful ideas involved in how people are motivated. But all of this motivation begins with where we are in life. Let me read a scripture to you. I mean, not a scripture. This is from the Course in Miracles. And this to me is the caps up. You'll discover everything I believe about the mind right here in this one little paragraph. The mind is very powerful. It never loses its creative force. It never sleeps. Every instant it is creating. It is hard to recognize that thought and belief combine into a powerful surge that can literally move mountains. Okay, well then this force creates. This force that is your mind. Now sometimes we might say it's miscreating. If left alone, what we have to do, what is our part, Spirit does so much and covers so much territory that every once in a while I'm coasting along and I forget I'm supposed to show up and suit up. That's my part of the job. I'm supposed to do what I can do when the opportunity comes up. It's just like the healing process that I've been going through with my knee. I'm supposed to be doing exercises. I'm supposed to be doing everything I can do rather than just saying, okay, I've prayed a prayer and God is taking care of everything. Well, when I get to the people that are doing the rehab for me, the therapist, I have threatened them to have them arrested for attempted murder. When I'm talking, I refer to their place as the little shop of horrors. But the mind creates, and if we leave it just like it is, it's still working. And people wonder, like, what is happening in their life? And where is this force going? Where it's like not guided. We, with our thoughts and the desires of our heart, you know, God honors the desires of our hearts. Delight yourself in the Lord. This is the first step, for He will give you the desires of your heart. But that delighting in is simply the abiding truth within yourself and living within this truth and with the presence of God, knowing it's there, living within this presence. Okay, this is what begins to happen. But if we leave it unmanaged, then we don't know what we're getting. And it begins to appear that there are just lots of accidents and coincidences in life, which there really isn't. There really isn't, because we are supposed to be in charge of the force that's within us. I have a story, and it's sort of, I've read it so many times back in the past. I've studied a lot of history, and it's just always been fascinating to me. But one of the characters in history that I got sort of to reading about, and then checked another biographer, and his name is James. I can't remember exactly the year he was born, but he lived in the early 1800s. He was a young man, and he was just from a moderate type family, in that they didn't have a lot, but they had a store, and they made a living. But that was about all. And they were able to send him to law school. And then when he got out of law school, well, James began his practice. And of all the things to happen to him, he met the love of his life. Her name was Ann Coleman. And James was so in love. I mean, this guy was smitten. And they got engaged. She was in love with him. They got engaged. But then there was a fly in the ointment. Her dad was one of the early multi-millionaires of the early 1800s. He was in the something about iron and steel business. And he made up his mind that the only reason that James could be interested in his family and in his daughter was the hope of coming into wealth and riches. So he broke the whole thing up. However, I can't remember the whole story, but I remember that she left town to live with an older sister and caught something or other, and it was uncertain just what caused her death, but she died. And so James wrote this letter, a scathing letter. In fact, it's been saved because it was sent back to him, and it was to where it's still available to read. But it was blaming him for everything, and apparently he got over it, because James began to accept that she was still part of his life. And that he treated like a muse, and that he had conversations about decisions he had to make. And he went through all of these things. It's like a ritual to where she was still there and still a part of his life. So he began in public service. And he had one job and another job and another job, and he was constantly motivated by her presence. And eventually, he became the 15th president of the United States, James Buchanan. He was the one right before Lincoln that sort of held everything together for 4 years before everything broke loose. But he never married. He's the only president we've ever had that never, ever married, that was a confirmed bachelor right to the end. And his life was remarkable in that he had found a motivation. Now, the interesting thing about it, I've always wondered in that it seemed like the motivation was a little bit outside himself in the beginning, but it must have internalized, because he did some very unusual things along the way in life. Now, the other thing that in studying what motivates you, I look back at my own life, because I started out in a ministry of a fundamentalist type ministry, and went to college. And at about I was just nearly 19 when I decided I'm going to give my life to Christ. I'm going to surrender my life to the ministry. The motivation that I had was not within myself, but it was, I'm doing this for God and for Jesus. That was the motivation I had. Well, there came a point then to where I left the ministry. And it wasn't that I felt like that it was wrong. I felt like I wasn't teaching what I really believed in my heart. But the idea was that whatever that was, it was like something in heaven someplace else rather than inside of me. Now, I went into construction, and the new motivation that was really wonderful at the time was little children. I had 3 children. And that was a really good motivation for me until I reached a point, and guess what? They all grew up and left. And this is about the time of a divorce, and my life just sort of wandered around until finally one day I discovered that there was an emerging force within myself that was like a guide, that was like a knowing. And there were times that I would say, man, I wish that I had learned this much sooner, and it would have made so much difference. But then one day I thought about it, and I said, do you know, I'm not sure whether that was best or not. Maybe discovering that outside forces are things that would please others that are without us, going through that experience might have been one of the most valuable things in my life. Have you ever thought of things like that? Have you ever looked back on a mistake or something that looked like a disaster and then discovered that it led you to the truth that you are experiencing now? This is what it's supposed to be. This is the God business at work within your life. It's not as though Spirit abandons us ever, even when we're full of that goofiness, or like I refer to that period of my life as postgraduate work in goofyology. But it was a lesson. Pat has a few things that she refers to as her Harvard education. Of course, none of you have ever been through anything like that, probably. So that's, God bless you. You're my example. Okay. Now let's take a look at forces from without ourselves. Sometimes it's parents trying to show us the way, and they become our motivation. And sometimes it's others, like teachers or someone. Now, it's one thing for someone to encourage you and to say something in your life that helps you. For example, I don't know whether anybody remembers who Jack Walsh is. It's been a while. But from, I'm trying to tell you the date. Okay, 1981 to 2000, he was the CEO. What? General Electric. Yeah, I've got it. It's terrible when you're up here and blank out. He stuttered. He stuttered as a child. And when he was 5 years old, he was so embarrassed to go to kindergarten because they would tease him about stuttering. And his mother said to him, and she was a very, very strong person, and her word was like the word of God. And she said to him, Jack, she said, the reason you stutter, he said, you are such a genius, and your mind works so fast that your mouth just can't catch up with you. So that kind of motivation is another thing. That is called encouragement at a beautiful level. All right. Now, an emerging force. Now, finally, I'm going to get to the point. I wanted to talk about Harmony Fellowship as an emerging force. Think about that. Just sort of accidentally put it together. I don't really know how this possibly could have happened. It's a God thing. But it started out just a handful of people, and then not even intending to be a church. And now it has become an emerging force. Recently, I was looking over, and I can't even remember all of them, all of the charities we give to. If you're a person who just shows up occasionally or comes to church and really doesn't look into other things, you have no idea how much money this church and individual offerings besides what the check is that the church writes to things like the food bank, I think it's called the women's shelter. I know that at Christmas time, all of these lists come in from children that are there of things that they need, and that a group of people from here go out and take care of those things. The idea that I've thought about so much is how important it is what we as a group are doing. It's like an emerging force. And this happens when people begin to pray together and they begin to experience just pure God's love for one another. It seems like that this is what we've developed here. And this is what we wish to keep going. It's not built around any personality. This is sort of an experiment. Do you ever feel like a guinea pig? Well, I don't really think I know of another congregationally driven church. There's not exactly a boss anywhere. I'm certainly not the one. Not even at home. I don't always get the boss. On my job. Is somebody going to say something?
I was going to say something. You were the boss of you last week when Pat wasn't here, and you missed her like crazy. You know that's the truth, Glenn.
I don't know what to do until she tells me. You know what?
Okay, you wear the pants, but she tells you which ones to put on.
That's right. She picks the tie, shirt. What we want to do, we want to keep this going. This isn't depending on just one person, like I said. It's certainly not. And I think that, I don't know what would happen, say like somebody came forward and proclaiming a sort of a self-proclaimed boss. We don't need that here, do we? We don't really need that. I love it just like it is. I have so much confidence in the board that, like I said, I just sort of nod. Sometimes I nap a little bit because I know, and I totally believe in what they're thinking and doing. I don't know how. It just seems like that God led me here and led them here to do what I call a congregationally driven church. If you think your ideas are missed, they're not. I mean, somebody takes them into consideration. And we have wonderful, wonderful leadership here in that area, managing it and everything. What we want to do is to keep it going. There is another little thing. This is Course in Miracles too. If you attack error in another, you hurt yourself. Any pettiness, which, like I said, I try to look at the very best. So frequently, if there is anything like that, I don't even see it. I'm not aware. Everything always looks perfect to me. And that may not be a good way to live, but it just feels like that it's wonderful. It feels like it takes away all of the trying to figure out or judge about whether somebody's sincere or whatever. I don't ever think about that. I don't ever think about it. What I want us to do is to not be petty about anything, because that sort of causes everything to deteriorate. What we have is a harmony in God, and this is a harmony of love which will carry us to wherever we need to be in this emerging force that we have become. Thank you.